It was a quiet Saturday morning in the Blake mansion, the kind of morning when everything seemed to shine a little brighter. Sunlight poured through the massive glass windows, catching on polished marble floors and gleaming chandeliers. The house was immaculate, as it always was, and every detail seemed to reflect the wealth and power of its owner, billionaire Richard Blake. From the outside, his life looked perfect. Money, influence, and a sprawling estate that most people could only dream of. But what Richard never expected was that one simple moment, hidden behind the laughter of his children, would turn his entire perspective upside down. Richard was a man known for his strict routines and his sharp eye. Nothing ever escaped his notice. He built his fortune on being detail-oriented, on spotting what others overlooked. And it was that same precision that earned him the reputation of being intimidating and distant. His staff knew the rules. No distractions, no shortcuts, and certainly no blurring the line between their world and his. But in the heart of his home, where his young sons played, those rules were about to be tested in a way that he could never have predicted. The boys, aged 6 and 8, had always been full of energy, always searching for excitement in a house that often felt too quiet and controlled. Their mother, who had passed away years earlier, had been the one who filled their days with warmth, fun, and imagination. Since her absence, the mansion had grown colder, even with all its beauty. Richard loved his children, but his way of showing it often came in the form of expensive gifts, private tutors, and carefully planned schedules. What he didn't realize was that what his sons craved most wasn't another toy or another lesson. It was connection. And on that particular morning, someone unexpected gave it to them. As Richard returned earlier than usual from a business meeting, the sound of laughter echoed down the hall. Not the polite laughter he was used to hearing at charity galas or in boardrooms, but genuine childlike laughter, wild, unrestrained, and filled with joy. He paused at the entrance of the playroom, surprised. The laughter grew louder, joined by voices that didn't belong to his sons alone. For a moment he frowned, wondering which of the staff had dared to overstep their boundaries. Then he saw her. On the floor, crawling on hands and knees, was Maria, the maid who had been with his household for nearly a year. Her usually neat uniform was wrinkled, her hair slightly out of place, and her face glowed with laughter as his 2 sons clung to her back, shouting and giggling. "Go faster, horsey!" they cried, their small hands gripping her shoulders as though she were a prized steed. Maria neighed playfully, bouncing them up and down, her eyes sparkling with life. Richard froze in the doorway. His first instinct was anger. How dare she? A maid, rolling on the floor, playing horse in his house, in front of his children. It felt like a breach of every rule he had set, a collapse of the invisible wall between employer and employee. But before he could speak, before he could let his sharp words cut through the laughter, something stopped him. It was what he heard. Amid the joy and noise, Maria's voice softened. She wasn't just playing. She was saying something to his boys, something gentle, almost motherly. "Hold on tight," she whispered, her tone filled with warmth. "Don't worry, I won't let you fall. You're safe with me." The boys clung tighter, their little faces glowing with trust and happiness, as if those words meant more to them than all the toys money could buy. Richard's chest tightened. It had been so long since he had heard that kind of softness in his home, the kind of reassurance his wife used to give their sons before bedtime. His heart wavered, torn between outrage at the broken rules and an unfamiliar ache he couldn't quite name. But then, something else slipped from Maria's lips. Something he hadn't expected at all. Words that weren't meant for him, but carried a weight that rooted him in place. His breath caught, his mind racing as the meaning sank in. Suddenly the lines between right and wrong, rules and compassion, blurred completely. He stood there, hidden, caught between the urge to step in and the need to listen further. His sons, unaware of his presence, continued to laugh, their small hands holding on as though Maria was more than just a maid. She was someone who filled a space they had long been missing. Richard's jaw tightened, his thoughts spiraling. What had she just said? Why did it sound like she knew something about his family that she shouldn't? In that moment, The billionaire who thought he had control over everything realized he might be standing at the edge of a truth he wasn't ready to face. He had walked into the room expecting discipline, but what he heard left him frozen, questioning everything he thought he knew about his home, his children, and even himself. And as he lingered silently in the doorway, listening to the words that seemed to echo louder than any boardroom deal, Richard Blake felt his world tilt in a way he could not yet explain. What Maria said next would change everything. Richard didn't move. He remained in the shadow of the doorway, every muscle tense, his eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. His sons clung to Maria with pure joy, the kind of joy he rarely saw in them anymore. Their laughter rang out like music, but beneath it, Richard's ears stayed locked on the words Maria had whispered. It wasn't just playful chatter, not to him. It carried a tone of knowing, of tenderness, of something that felt deeper than a game. For a man who had built his empire by staying in control, by never letting his guard down, the uncertainty of what he had just heard gnawed at him. He thought back to the day Maria had first entered their lives. She had come from a local agency, quiet and reserved. Her resume unremarkable compared to others he had hired before. What set her apart was the way his boys had taken to her almost instantly. Normally, they were shy with strangers, clinging to one another or hiding behind their toys. But Maria had a way of lowering herself to their level, of making them feel seen, as if their words mattered. At the time, Richard had brushed it off, chalking it up to coincidence. Now, watching her in the playroom, he wasn't so sure. Maria's background had never really interested him. She was staff, nothing more. He paid well, expected loyalty, and that was enough. But in this moment, hearing her speak with such tenderness, he wondered who she really was. How did she know the exact words his children needed to hear? Why did her presence stir something in them that all his wealth and resources couldn't provide? His thoughts drifted to his late wife, Emily. She had been the heart of their family, the one who filled the mansion with warmth. She would chase the boys through the hallways, tell them stories at night, and laugh with them until they fell asleep in her arms. When she passed, everything changed. Richard tried to step in to provide what he thought they needed, but his efforts always came out wrong. Too stiff, too scheduled, too detached. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he didn't know how to show it. And now, here was Maria, bridging that gap without even trying, slipping into a role that had been empty for too long. But still, those words lingered in his mind. They hadn't been spoken lightly. There was weight behind them, as though Maria carried a secret. "You're safe with me." A simple phrase, but it echoed with something more. Something unspoken. And when she followed with those other words, the ones that made his heart skip, Richard realized he couldn't let it go. He needed to know what she meant. As he stood there, his sons slid off Maria's back, rolling onto the floor in a heap of laughter. She laughed with them, breathless, brushing the hair from her face. For a moment, she looked younger, freer, not the quiet maid who kept her head down during work hours. There was a light in her that Richard hadn't noticed before, one that seemed to draw his boys like moths to a flame. "Again, horsey. Again," his younger son begged, tugging at her sleeve. Maria smiled but shook her head gently. "Not now, little one. You need to rest. Remember what I told you. Strong horses know when to pause." The boy pouted but nodded, clearly used to listening to her. Richard narrowed his eyes. Since when did his sons follow instructions so easily? With him, every command was met with resistance, with sulks or complaints. Yet Maria had them wrapped around her finger, not through authority, but through trust. Richard's mind whirred with questions he couldn't shake. Who was Maria beyond the uniform? Why did she speak to his children as if she carried some personal understanding of their pain? He realized how little he actually knew about her. She was kind, yes. She was competent. But there was a layer beneath that, something hidden, and now it tugged at his curiosity with unrelenting force. As he lingered, a faint memory surfaced. A few weeks earlier, he had come home late from the office, passing by the nursery without being noticed. He had paused at the doorway then too, hearing Maria's voice as she tucked his youngest into bed. She had been telling a story, not one from a book, but one that sounded personal, filled with details too vivid to be made up on the spot. His son had hung on every word, and Richard, though exhausted, had stood there listening. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, connected with what he just heard, it struck him differently. Maria rose from the floor, gathering the toys scattered around. Her face shifted back into the calm, composed expression she always wore when Richard was around. She had no idea he was standing there, watching. His sons clung to her arms, begging her to stay and play longer, but she promised them she would return after tidying up. Richard stepped back silently, his mind racing. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, not without understanding more. He knew he had to dig deeper, to learn the truth about who she was and why she seemed to carry a piece of his children's hearts in her hands. He thought of calling the agency that had sent her, of demanding every record they had. He thought of questioning her directly, pressing her until she revealed whatever secret those words carried. But something told him this wasn't just about paperwork or background checks. This was personal, and the only way to uncover it was to watch, to listen, and to wait for her to slip again. As he retreated to his study, Richard couldn't shake the image of his sons' glowing faces, nor the sound of Maria's voice echoing in his head. He felt a mixture of anger, suspicion, and something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope. But beneath it all was a gnawing question that refused to leave him. What did Maria know that he didn't? And why, on that quiet Saturday morning, did her words feel like a key to a truth that could unravel everything he thought he understood about his family? The billionaire had built his empire by never ignoring his instincts. And his instincts told him one thing now. Maria was not just a maid. Not by a long shot. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in his massive bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the mansion pressing down on him. The echo of Maria's words replayed over and over in his mind, almost like a haunting. "You're safe with me." It should have been nothing more than a comforting phrase, but in Richard's ears it carried layers, as though she was speaking to more than just two children in a game. The unease in his chest refused to fade, gnawing at him in a way even the toughest business negotiations never had. In the early hours of the morning, Richard found himself wandering the halls. The mansion felt different in the dark, less like a palace and more like a hollow shell. He passed portraits of his late wife, Emily, the soft smile on her face a painful reminder of all he had lost. His sons barely remembered her voice, and he hated that. The truth was, he had buried his grief in work, convincing himself that money could fill the emptiness. But money didn't make children laugh the way Maria had made them laugh. And that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. He considered speaking to his sons directly, but something stopped him. What if they revealed too much? What if Maria had already told them things she shouldn't have? He didn't want to frighten them or break the fragile happiness she seemed to bring. Instead, Richard decided to keep his questions locked away, at least for now. He would watch her carefully, quietly, until the truth surfaced on its own. The next morning at breakfast, the air was strangely heavy. The boys, usually restless at the table, were quieter, sneaking glances toward the kitchen door as if waiting for someone. When Maria finally entered with a tray, their faces lit up. Richard noticed it instantly. The way they straightened in their chairs, the way their eyes followed her every move. She greeted them warmly, bending slightly to ask how they had slept, her voice carrying that same softness he had overheard the day before. But when her gaze briefly met Richard's, something flickered. Guardedness. A subtle hesitation, as though she knew he was watching her differently now. He caught it, and his suspicion deepened. Maria was careful, too careful. As days passed, Richard found himself paying closer attention to small details he had once overlooked. Maria never spoke much about herself. If asked, she redirected the conversation back to the boys. She never accepted gifts beyond her salary, no matter how small. And whenever the children were upset or restless, She had a way of calming them that no tutor, no nanny had ever managed. It wasn't just skill. It was connection. Almost as if she shared a bond with them that went deeper than simple care. One afternoon, while reviewing paperwork in his study, Richard overheard faint voices drifting through the half-open window. He rose quietly and stepped onto the balcony, where the sound was clearer. Maria was in the garden with his sons, her laughter rising above the rustling of leaves. But then came words that froze him again. "Your mother would be proud," she said softly. Richard's chest tightened. His sons went quiet for a moment before the younger one asked, "Do you really think so?" Maria answered without hesitation, "I know so. She loved you more than anything, and she's still with you always." Richard gripped the balcony railing. How did Maria know enough to say that? He had never spoken of Emily in front of her. Even the boys rarely brought her up anymore. It was too painful. The way Maria spoke wasn't distant, like someone repeating something she had been told. It was personal, intimate, almost as though she had known Emily herself. That thought unsettled him more than anything else. The more he searched for answers, the more questions piled up. His sons seemed happier, yes, but was it because of Maria's kindness, or because she knew something about their family that she wasn't telling him? And if she did know something, why had she kept it hidden? As Richard wrestled with these thoughts, another subplot began to surface. His business partner, Gregory, had been pushing him into a new investment deal that promised huge returns but carried risks Richard wasn't comfortable with. Normally, Richard would have been fully focused on dismantling the numbers, finding the weaknesses, and deciding whether to move forward. But now his concentration faltered. For the first time, his empire wasn't the only thing weighing on him. Gregory noticed. One evening over drinks he leaned closer and said, "You're distracted, Richard. That's not like you. Something going on at home." Richard brushed it off, but inside, he knew Gregory was right. His instincts told him that business and home life were about to collide in ways he couldn't predict. If Maria truly carried some connection to Emily, or some secret about the family, then it might reach beyond the walls of the mansion. And Richard wasn't about to let anyone use that against him. Meanwhile, Maria carried herself as though nothing had changed. She continued caring for the children, cooking meals and tidying rooms, all with the quiet efficiency that had made her invaluable. But Richard noticed something subtle. At night, when she thought no one was looking, she lingered in the nursery. Sometimes he would pass by and see her sitting in the rocking chair, staring out the window, lost in thought. Other times, he caught her brushing the boys' hair back as they slept, her expression heavy with something more than duty. One evening, unable to hold back, Richard asked his eldest son, "What do you and Maria talk about when I'm not here?" The boy hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door before answering. "She tells us stories. About Mom. About how strong she was, how she never gave up. She says Mom used to sing the same lullaby she sings to us now." Richard's breath caught. That lullaby was something only Emily used to hum, a tune she had made up when their first son was born. He had never told anyone about it, not even the staff. Now the mystery thickened. Richard's suspicion hardened into determination. There was no longer any doubt. Maria knew things she shouldn't, things she couldn't. The only question left was how. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Gregory was pressing harder for the investment deal, the board was growing restless, and now Richard found himself caught between protecting his company and uncovering a secret that might shatter the fragile peace in his home. The billionaire who had once believed he could control every part of his life was beginning to realize he couldn't control this. Not Maria. Not the way his sons looked at her. Not the secrets that hovered just out of reach. And deep down, a new fear took hold. What if Maria wasn't just carrying a secret about his family? What if Maria herself was the secret? The days that followed grew heavier with unspoken tension. Richard moved through his mansion like a shadow, his eyes sharper than ever, every glance at Maria a silent question. She seemed unchanged on the surface, still gentle with the children, still meticulous with her work, But beneath her calm exterior Richard sensed a guardedness, like someone carrying a truth too big to reveal. The more he watched her, the more his unease deepened. His instincts told him that whatever Maria was hiding, it was coming closer to the surface, whether she wanted it to or not. One evening, the storm finally began to break. Richard had returned from the office late. His mind torn between the risky business deal Gregory was pushing and the unanswered questions about Maria. The rain was pouring outside, thunder rolling through the hills, when he heard voices coming from the boys' room. He paused in the hallway, the sound of Maria's voice threading through the door, low and soothing. She was telling them a story again, but this time it was different. Richard leaned closer, his heart hammering. Her words weren't just stories, they were memories. "She used to sit by your beds," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Every night she'd kiss your foreheads and tell you how proud she was. Even when she was tired, even when she was hurting, she never let you feel alone. And she made me promise." Maria's voice faltered and Richard's breath caught. "She made me promise I would never let you forget her." Richard's blood ran cold. He shoved open the door without thinking, startling both the children and Maria. She froze, her face pale, her hand still resting on the edge of the bed. His sons looked between them, wide-eyed, sensing the storm that had suddenly entered the room. "What did you just say?" Richard demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Maria lowered her gaze, her lips pressed tightly together. "Nothing, sir. Just a bedtime story." "That wasn't just a story," he snapped, stepping closer. "How do you know what she said? How do you know anything about my wife?" The boys shifted nervously, clinging to the blankets. Maria's hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "Please, not in front of them." Her restraint only fueled his suspicion. He wanted answers, but the children's frightened faces forced him to hold back. He left the room abruptly, his footsteps echoing down the hall, but inside his mind was boiling. The walls of control he had spent years building were starting to crack. The next day, Richard began his own investigation. He had his assistant pull every record on Maria. Her employment history, her background, even her references. On paper, everything appeared clean. Too clean. No inconsistencies, no gaps, nothing unusual at all. It was as if her life had been scrubbed spotless before she stepped into his home. That, more than anything, set his alarm bells ringing. At the same time, the pressure from Gregory escalated. He pushed for signatures, reminding Richard that delays could cost them millions. But Richard's focus was slipping. His thoughts consumed by the woman who seemed to know more about his family than she should. Gregory noticed his distraction again. His voice edged with frustration. "If you can't keep your head in the game, Richard, someone else will. Don't forget, money doesn't wait for anyone." Richard brushed him off, but the words lingered. For the first time, his empire felt fragile, like sand slipping through his fingers, and the cause wasn't the market or his competitors. It was something unfolding under his own roof. The turning point came 2 nights later. Richard returned earlier than usual and found Maria in the living room with the boys. They were huddled together on the floor, and she was singing. The melody was soft, hauntingly familiar, the same lullaby Emily had once sung. His sons swayed gently, their eyes half closed in peace. But for Richard the sound was like a lightning strike. His chest tightened, his vision blurred, and before he could stop himself he spoke. "Where did you learn that song?" Maria froze mid-note, her face draining of color. The boys looked at their father, then back at her, sensing the tension. Richard stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "That song belonged to my wife. No one else knew it. No one. So I'll ask again, where did you learn it?" Maria rose slowly, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes glistening with something between fear and sorrow. For the first time, Richard saw cracks in her composure, a vulnerability she had carefully hidden until now. "I can't answer that," she whispered. Her refusal only deepened the suspense, twisting Richard's insides with anger and dread. His sons clung to her sides, their small voices pleading, "Dad, don't be mad. Please don't send her away." Richard's world felt as though it was closing in. He stood there, torn between his children's desperate eyes and the storm of questions raging inside him. Who was Maria? What promise had she made? And why did she seem to carry a piece of Emily's memory with her? The rain outside pounded harder, rattling the windows, as though the storm mirrored the chaos in his heart. Richard had spent his life believing there was always an answer, always a way to take control. But now, in his own home, with his sons clutching a woman who was no longer just a maid, he realized he was standing on the edge of something bigger than he could yet understand. Every instinct screamed that the truth was close, unbearably close. And whatever it was, it would change everything. Maria's lips parted, as if she might finally break her silence. Richard's breath caught, waiting, dreading, needing to hear the words. But before she could speak, the doorbell rang. The sharp chime cut through the tension like a blade. All heads turned toward the sound, the storm outside raging louder. Richard's pulse quickened. He wasn't expecting anyone. At this hour on a night like this, the arrival could mean anything. And in that suspended moment, with unanswered questions hanging in the air and fear creeping through the walls of the mansion, Richard knew the story was about to reach its breaking point. The truth was at the door. The echo of the doorbell lingered in the vast halls, sharp and unexpected against the storm's roar. Richard's sons clutched tighter to Maria, their eyes wide with worry. She stood frozen, her face pale, as if she already knew who it might be. Richard's gut twisted. Whoever was at the door had chosen the worst possible moment, just when the truth felt like it was about to break free. He strode quickly to the entrance, his polished shoes striking the marble floor in heavy beats. The storm rattled the windows, lightning flashing as he pulled the door open. Standing there, drenched from the rain, was a man Richard had never seen before. His coat clung to his tall frame, and his eyes, dark, piercing, shifted past Richard as if searching for something inside the house. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his tone hard. The stranger's voice was low but steady. "I need to speak to Maria." The name hung in the air like a loaded gun. Richard stiffened, his grip on the door tightening. "Maria works for me. Whatever business you have with her, you'll tell me first." Behind him, he heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. Maria had stepped into the hallway, her face stricken as she saw the man. She whispered something under her breath, so soft Richard almost didn't catch it. "Not here, not now." The stranger's eyes softened when they met hers, but there was urgency in them too. "You've waited long enough. They deserve to know." Richard's heart pounded. "Hey." The word rang in his head, heavy with implication. His sons were peeking around the corner now, their small faces lit by the flicker of lightning. The man's gaze flicked toward them briefly before settling back on Maria. "What is going on?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp, his patience unraveling. Maria's lips parted, but no words came. She looked between Richard, the man, and the children, caught in a silent battle. For the first time since she entered his home, Richard saw real fear in her eyes. Not of him, but of what the truth might unleash. The stranger stepped forward slightly, his voice firm but calm. "She can't keep carrying this alone. You've kept walls around your family, Mr. Blake, but walls don't erase the past. And sooner or later, the past finds its way in." Richard's pulse raced as the man's words cut deeper than he expected. He had built his life on control, on order, on burying pain under layers of wealth and power. But now those words felt like an accusation. He turned to Maria, his voice trembling with both anger and desperation. "Tell me who he is. Tell me what you're hiding." Maria shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's not that simple." The storm outside thundered louder, shaking the glass panes as if the house itself felt the weight of what was unfolding. Richard's sons crept closer, clinging to each other, sensing that the world they knew was tilting. The stranger's expression hardened. If you don't tell him, I will. Maria's eyes widened in panic. Please, not like this. The tension was unbearable. Richard's mind churned, piecing fragments together. The lullabies, the stories, the promises, and now this man showing up on his doorstep. His instincts screamed that he was standing at the edge of a truth that would shatter the fragile balance in his home. And then the second twist hit him like a blow. The man looked directly at Richard and said, "You're not the only one who lost Emily." The name, spoken with such weight, silenced everything. Richard's throat tightened. His sons gasped, their small voices echoing in the stillness. Maria covered her mouth, her shoulders trembling as if the words had ripped open a wound she had kept buried. Richard staggered back a step. "What did you just say?" The stranger's eyes held his, unflinching. "She wasn't just your wife. She was my sister." The words slammed into Richard, unraveling years of certainty in a single breath. Emily had never spoken of a brother. Not once. She had told him of her parents, her childhood, but never this. Why? Why would she hide something so significant? Richard's heart raced, the room spinning as the implications crashed down. Maria knew. That's why she carried Emily's memories, why she whispered promises only his wife could have made. She wasn't just a maid. She was tied to Emily, tied to the past Richard had never truly understood. The man stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Maria has been keeping her promise to Emily. She's been protecting the boys, giving them what you couldn't. And you deserve to know why she came here." Maria's tears spilled freely now, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to happen like this." Richard's sons turned to him, confusion written all over their young faces. "Dad, what does he mean?" Richard stood frozen, his entire world shifting under his feet. The storm outside raged louder, lightning illuminating the stranger's face, casting shadows that made the mansion feel less like a home and more like a stage for secrets finally clawing their way to the surface. The billionaire who thought he had control of everything suddenly realized he was surrounded by truths he had never been allowed to see. And as the storm howled through the night, Richard understood one thing. The real conflict had only just begun. Because if Emily had secrets deep enough to hide a brother, then there was no telling what else lay buried in the past, waiting to tear everything apart. The storm outside had reached its peak when Edward finally gathered the courage to step forward from the hallway. His shoes made a faint sound against the polished marble floor, yet in the heavy silence of the house, it felt deafening. The maid froze where she was, her arms wrapped protectively around the youngest boy, who clung to her as if she were the only safe harbor he knew. The oldest son, still holding a small toy horse, looked up at his father with wide, unblinking eyes. Edward's heart pounded, the sound of his pulse loud in his ears. For weeks he had felt that something was slipping through his grasp, not just in business but within the very walls of his home. And now, standing there, he realized the truth he had tried to avoid. The maid's voice was soft but firm, trembling yet steady enough to carry weight. "Mr. Blake," she said, "your sons needed something you didn't know they were missing. And I gave it to them the only way I could." Edward stiffened, anger flashing for a moment, but before he could speak, his eldest son interrupted. "Papa, she tells us stories. Stories about you." The words hit him harder than he expected. He frowned, confusion etching deeper into his features. "Stories about me?" he asked, his voice low. The boy nodded. "Not about the billionaire who goes to meetings all day. About the boy you were before. About horses and fields and how you used to laugh." Edward's throat tightened. He hadn't told anyone about those memories in years. Not even his wife knew how much he had loved those early days on his grandfather's farm, where the smell of hay and the sound of hooves had once been his whole world. How could this maid possibly know? He stared at her, searching for an explanation. She swallowed hard before answering, and her eyes shimmered with something between guilt and determination. "Because I knew your family back then," she whispered. "Long before you became who you are now." The air seemed to shift. Edward blinked, his mind racing. He looked closer, seeing past the plain uniform and the quiet presence she had maintained in the house for months. Something about her face stirred a long-forgotten memory, a girl who used to run barefoot through the fields beside him, daring him to race the wind. Clara! The name slipped out before he could stop it. The maid's eyes widened, tears welling up as she nodded. The realization crashed over him. This wasn't just a stranger employed in his house. This was someone from his past, someone who had known him when he was just Edward, not Edward Blake the billionaire. His sons clutched her more tightly, sensing the gravity of the moment, while Edward's breath came shallow, his chest tight with disbelief. "You disappeared," he said, his voice breaking. "One day you were gone, and no one knew why." Clara lowered her gaze, pain flickering across her features. "My family had nothing. We left overnight, and I thought I would never see this place again. But years later, when I heard you were here, with children of your own, I came back. Not for money, not for the job, but because I wanted to see if you were still the boy who believed in simpler things." The storm outside rattled the windows, but the real storm was inside Edward. Memories clashed with the present, and the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He looked at his sons, his flesh and blood, clinging to Clara with a kind of love and trust they had never shown him. He realized they weren't just playing horse. They were chasing something he had denied them without knowing: warmth, joy, and connection. But then came the twist he hadn't expected. Clara stepped back slightly and said, "Your father knew too. He told me to find you if I ever returned. He wanted you to remember what mattered before it was too late." Edward froze, the words slicing through him like ice. His father had passed years ago, and with him had gone countless regrets and unspoken conversations. And yet, here was Clara, carrying a message he could no longer hear from the man himself. His sons tugged at his sleeve. "Papa, did Grandpa really say that?" Edward couldn't answer immediately. His voice faltered as he finally knelt down beside them, looking into their expectant faces. For the first time in years, he felt stripped of titles, wealth, and power. He was only a man, a father, confronted with the truth that money could not fill the emptiness that had quietly grown in his home. The climax unfolded not in anger, but in a painful, beautiful revelation. Edward's wealth had built walls, but Clara's return had broken them down. The tension that had hung like a shadow over the house now shifted into something else: the heavy responsibility of choice. He could push her away again, or he could let her remind him of the man he once was. And just when he thought the truth had all been laid bare, Clara added the final twist. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "Edward, I didn't just come back for you. There's something else you need to know. Something about your sons." The room fell into silence, even the storm seeming to hush for a moment. Edward's heart pounded faster than ever. He leaned closer, his entire world hanging on what she would say next. But Clara stopped, her lips trembling as she held back the revelation. The unfinished words hung in the air, leaving Edward and his children on the edge of discovery. And with that, the story's final twist set the stage for a truth far deeper than Edward had ever expected, one that could change everything forever. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he steadied himself against the edge of the doorway. The storm outside was still raging, lightning casting flashes of white across the grand living room, but the silence inside was louder than thunder. Clara's unfinished words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on all of them. His sons looked at her with wide, innocent eyes, waiting for an answer that even Edward wasn't sure he was ready to hear. He had faced boardrooms, hostile takeovers, and headlines that could shake entire industries, but nothing prepared him for the vulnerability of this moment. Clara finally drew in a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on Edward. "Your sons," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "They don't need a perfect father. They need the one you used to be. The boy who once knew how to play, who once knew how to listen, who didn't measure everything in numbers and contracts." She paused, tears forming in her eyes. "I came back because I saw the distance growing between you and them. And I couldn't stand by and watch them lose you the way I once lost you. The words cut deep. Edward felt them like a mirror shattering against stone, each shard reflecting a version of himself he had buried beneath years of ambition. He looked at his boys. His eldest still gripping the toy horse tightly, the younger still clinging to Clara's dress, and he realized she was right. His children didn't care about the empire he had built, the wealth he had stacked, or the influence he wielded. They cared about him, the man behind the suit and title. A heavy silence lingered before his eldest son broke it. "Papa, we just wanted you to play with us," he said softly. His voice cracked with the honesty only a child could carry. "We wanted you to laugh with us. Like she does." The words sank into Edward's chest, heavier than any business deal, heavier than any burden he had carried. Edward sank to his knees, eye level with his son's. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling with a rawness he had long hidden. "I didn't see it. I thought giving you everything money could buy was enough. But I forgot the most important thing, me." His boys looked at him, their small faces shifting from confusion to something softer. The younger one reached forward, placing a tiny hand on Edward's cheek, as if forgiving him without needing further explanation. Clara turned away, giving the family a moment, but Edward called her name softly. "Clara, don't go. You brought something back into this home I didn't even realize we were missing. If my father trusted you enough to carry his words, then I have no reason not to." She turned back, her expression torn between surprise and relief. "I never wanted to take your place," she said. "I only wanted to remind you of it." The storm outside began to quiet, the thunder moving further away, almost as if nature itself had waited for this moment to pass before easing its grip. The boys pulled Edward and Clara closer, their laughter breaking through the tension as the youngest asked, "Papa, will you play horse with us too?" For the first time in years, Edward didn't hesitate. He smiled, though it trembled, and said, "Yes, I'll play." And in that moment, as he let his sons climb onto his back, laughter filling the air, the house felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Edward and Clara sat across from each other at the dining table. No words were spoken for a long while. The weight of the past, the years lost, and the choices made hung between them. Finally, Edward broke the silence. "I don't know if I can ever repay you," he admitted. "Not for the past, not for tonight. But I want to try. I want my sons to grow up knowing not just who I am, but who I was before I forgot myself." Clara gave a small, tired smile. "You don't owe me anything. Just don't lose them. That's all I ever wanted." As Edward lay in bed later that night, he replayed everything in his mind. The sight of Clara with his children, the sound of their laughter, the echo of his father's wisdom carried across time. It all came together into something that wealth could never buy. A second chance. He understood now that legacy wasn't just measured in business success or public image. It was measured in the love and memories he built within these walls. The days that followed were different. Edward still attended his meetings, still signed contracts, still carried the weight of his empire, but he also came home earlier. He took his sons to the stables, letting them feed and brush the horses. He listened to their stories, their dreams, their laughter. Clara remained, not as just a maid but as a reminder of the bond between past and present, and the importance of holding on to the things that matter most. The final twist of the night remained in Edward's heart, the knowledge that his father had seen this coming long before he had. His father had entrusted Clara with more than a message. He had entrusted her with hope. And through her, Edward had rediscovered not just his role as a father, but his humanity. The mansion no longer felt cold. The echoes of footsteps down its halls were no longer lonely but filled with laughter, warmth, and connection. The billionaire had caught his maid playing horse with his sons, and though it shocked him at first, what he heard next had changed everything. He didn't just find his children's joy. He found his own redemption. And as Edward watched his sons sleeping peacefully that night, he whispered a quiet promise to himself. "Never again will I let wealth come before love." It was the kind of promise that could shape a lifetime, one that he intended to keep. The story had begun with suspicion and shock, but it ended with something far greater: understanding, forgiveness, and a family finally whole.